So you
Okay.
can be in a relationship that's mildly unsafe, or you can be in one that's very, very unsafe. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Ask Patrick Doyle show. Today, I am joined, as usual, by Amber Lynn. Amber is a life transitions coach, and she's also the community relations director for Pathway to Hope, which is an online membership program for women who are being harmed in emotionally abusive relationships, are getting out of them, or in any way are trying to figure out how to manage their lives with someone who's abusing them. So, thank you for being here, Amber. And I understand there's some questions that we're going to answer today. So, what are they?
Absolutely. So the first one is, how do you know if you are in an unsafe relationship?
Huh. Well, so let's just talk about unsafe for a second, okay? Because I believe unsafe has a spectrum or a continuum. So you
Okay.
can be in a relationship that's mildly unsafe, or you can be in one that's very, very unsafe, right? So there's a continuum. And so here's the thing that I want to really emphasize for people who are trying to decide that. The number one factor for you to decide whether or not you're in an unsafe relationship is you.
Mm,
But in an unsafe relationship, generally the person you're in a relationship with is trying to define it for you.
mm,
They're telling you what, no, you shouldn't feel that way. No, that's not really how it went. No,
yeah.
they're gaslighting, they're minimizing, they're rationalizing, they're justifying, they're blame shifting, all those things. So you start to lose context of your own perceptions.
Yeah.
And so, in any way, shape, or form, if you feel unsafe,
Mhm.
that's when you know you're in an unsafe relationship. If you have 50.00001% of a lack of emotional trust,
Mhm.
you're in an unsafe relationship. So, and remember, trust is also a continuum: low trust, high trust. So, generally speaking, if someone you're in a relationship with is unsafe, the guaranteed reality is they are going to continually over time erode the trust. And you're going to, as that happens, you're going to have to do more denying, more rationalizing, more justifying, more spiritualizing. You're going to have to take more shots of hopium instead of dealing with the reality that what they're doing is eroding the trust through their behavior.
Mhm.
And so this is one of the things I see all the time is that when people ask, if they're asking me if they're in an unsafe relationship, my general answer is, if you're asking the question, yes.
Mm.
To what degree? Let's talk about it.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that makes sense.
Hmm.
So can we talk about unsafe behaviors then? What are some of them?
Yeah. So in my world, as the community relations director for Pathway to Hope, you know how many women we've talked to who have been in emotionally abusive relationships
Yeah.
where the behavior is very difficult to articulate and it's very difficult to prove because it's so secret and private. Generally, when someone's unsafe, they're not being unsafe in a public place. They put on their best face in public. They're actually maybe even charming in public, and they maybe are a good talker, and people really like them, and they go way overboard to make sure other people like them. But when the door shuts, it's a different thing when no one can see. So, some of the behaviors I will tell you,
Yeah.
number one, like overarching principle is if you're in a relationship with someone who will not take responsibility
Mhm.
for their harm of you, you're in a bad situation. And
Mhm.
so anytime you're in a relationship with someone who won't take responsibility, the consequence is you end up feeling crazy.
Mm.
And I've heard this from thousands of women. I just feel crazy. Like I'm always trying to get to the bottom of it, but I never can
Mhm.
because the person who's being unsafe or abusive is rationalizing, minimizing, justifying, denying, blame shifting, gaslighting, spiritualizing, and undermining the perception that you're trying to put forward. So what happens is we start to think there's something wrong with us. Like, well, maybe I'm too sensitive. Well, maybe I'm just not ever satisfied. Well, we go through all the mental gymnastics of trying to make what they're saying work.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is all that when they're denying it and rationalizing and all that, what they're doing is undermining and actually destroying your soul. It's a soul destroying reality. I call it the death of 1,000 cuts.
Yeah.
So if you looked at one of the cuts, you told somebody about one behavior, they'd go, oh yeah, well, that's not that big a deal. It's just, one thing. But if you told them about 1,000, then it's like, oh no, that's terrible. But we never tell everybody about 1,000. In fact, in my own situation, I was complicit with covering it up.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want anybody to know. And so that's the other part of it, is that we also get involved trying to make unsafe or abusive work because we want it to work. And if we work hard enough, then it'll all turn out, right? No. And I say this all the time to people in these relationships. And again, trust me, if you're a guy and you're in an abusive relationship, or you're a guy and you're in an unsafe relationship, I'm talking about women primarily because that's what I deal with. But these principles apply to both. So don't think that because you're a guy, it doesn't apply to you. If you're in an unsafe relationship, the same principles apply. And trust me, there are plenty of women who are abusive and or unhealthy or unsafe. So, when you start to feel crazy, when you are confused a lot is another sign. And here's one of the things I will tell you. People say, well, I'm confused. So like I said, I've talked to lots of people. So let's just say I'm talking to someone and they explain to me the situation. They articulate it very easily. We have a great conversation. There's no confusion. Then that same person goes to the person they're in the relationship with and they're confused because the person that you're talking to is manipulating you. So if you're confused primarily with one person on a regular basis, it's not because there's something wrong with you. It's because you're being manipulated. That is my rule of thumb.
Wow. Yeah. So how does this look in the church?
Well, in the church, you have a whole nother set of layers. And, having been a pastor for years and having been in the church for years, I understand this at a deep level. So generally speaking, the church is set up so that the woman has a higher level of responsibility for any problem and a higher level of responsibility for solving the problem than the man. And generally speaking, the church approaches it where the man is the one that the woman needs to serve, needs to give to, needs to give sex to, so that he doesn't become a porn addict, needs to have sex with him so that he won't have an affair, needs to feed him well so he'll come home, needs, all these things that are, and a lot of times they're not overtly spoken. A lot of times it's just like the over the glasses, like implication to women, and it's culturally embedded. So it's very nuanced. Some churches, they just say it outright, but those are fewer and fewer. And now it's much more nuanced. So in that reality stems from a theological belief that I have held. So I understand, and by no means do I have judgment, but I am also not going to say that it's not okay, that it's okay because you have a theological underpinning. No. In my process of seeing the tragedy of the advice I was giving is what started to wake me up to the fact that it was really bad. So the theological underpinning is that men are more valuable than women. And this is the growth of that is, the example of that is that men are allowed to serve in leadership and women are not. Eve was deceived, not Adam. So men are spiritually superior to women. And, just as a side note, I don't know if anybody knows this, but if you look closely at the text of the Old Testament where it talks about Adam and Eve, or Eve being in the Garden of Eden and being tempted by Satan, guess who is right next to her? Adam. He was not somewhere else. He was present. He just didn't say anything. So that level of disregard,
Mhm.
it goes all the way back to the Bible. Adam was disregarding the person he was supposed to care about by saying nothing, right?
Mhm.
And so this is the other thing that I see being paramount in unsafe relationships is somebody that disregards you.
Mhm.
And one of the ways I see this all the time, I hear ladies say this all the time. Well, he just forgets a lot. He just has a hard time remembering. And I'm like, no. If it was what time is the football game on, there ain't no forgetting. If it's what time am I going fishing with my buddy, they don't forget. When
Yeah.
someone regularly forgets to bring home an item from the grocery store that you texted them or called them right before they left work and they forget, the reason why they forget is because they don't care. Forgetting is about not caring. When
Mm.
something is important, we do not forget it. And so,
Mhm.
relationally speaking, women go through this all the time. Oh, I forgot. Oh, I forgot, which is really just long term, unabated disregard. And if you're in a relationship that is where you're getting a lot of disregard, you are going to slowly, solically die. It's
Yeah.
being disregarded is the antithesis of what relationships are made for.
Mm.
Relationships are made so that two people can regard each other highly,
Yeah.
not disregard each other.
Yeah.
And so this is the other thing, the avoidance of difficulty, the avoidance of the issue, the person not having the ability to own their responsibility in a problem is another level of harm.
Mhm.
And what I see all the time is women and men who work tirelessly and very hard to put energy in to try this, read that book, go to that counselor, go to this seminar, do this thing, do that thing. And I use this analogy a lot. It's giving CPR to a dead guy. You're giving CPR, you're going through all this energy, but the guy's dead. The person's dead. They're not coming back. No matter how long you try, it ain't going to change the outcome.
Mhm.
And this is the hard part in an unsafe relationship or an abusive relationship is being able to let that thing go.
Mhm.
And a little side note freebie, uh, people, we talk about trauma bonds. I'm bonded to them through the trauma of what's happened and blah, 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 or whatever. Yeah, I understand what trauma bonds, I understand what they're saying, but I think more consistently what the issue is that the person that's in the relationship and they're being harmed, what bonds them to the relationship is them wanting something from the relationship that it cannot and has not ever given them.
Mm.
So when you allow yourself to grieve the loss or the death of your dream, the loss of the thing you wanted, boom. As soon as you start doing that grieving, the person that has power over you, their power starts to dissipate. But
Mhm.
here's what we do in unsafe or abusive relationships is we give effort to the relationship, we try harder, we do the next thing as a way to prevent our own pain from coming to the surface. It's how we avoid the grief. And
Mhm.
listen, every single one of us is pre-programmed to avoid difficulty
Yeah.
and avoid harm. None of us want to walk into the buzzsaw, I say, but it's a requirement to get well. You cannot be in an unhealthy relationship and stay there and expect it to suddenly become something that it will never be. So here's the thing: we move in to help. We read books, we get information, we look at podcasts, we they watch videos, and I do all that instead of grieving the loss of the thing I wanted.
Mm.
And once you grieve the loss of the thing you wanted and recognize that it's not going to happen,
Mhm.
you move from putting energy into it to putting energy into grieving.
Mhm.
And I say this all the time because listen, none of us are going to have the clarity, realize what's happening and that it's unsafe and all of our efforts have not paid off, and then move into the grief and stay there. What we do is we move into the grief, we're like, ow, 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 and then we go out and we go back to trying. And then we come back to grief and then we go back to trying. But if you're in that ping pong, yay, because that means you're moving. That means it's slowly seeping in that this is not what I wanted and it's not going to change. Now, one of the questions I get all the time is how do I know if the change is genuine? Well, one of the main reasons is that you feel trust. So, with people who are unsafe and abusive, one of the main things they do is what I call an acknowledgement blame shift apology. So what they do is they acknowledge that they hurt you.
Mm-hmm.
They acknowledge it. So you're like, oh, they get it.
Yeah.
No.
No.
Acknowledgement and acceptance are two different things. So they acknowledge that they did something and then they blame shift in their apology. Yes, I spoke to you harshly, but I wouldn't have had to do that if you weren't reacting.
Mm-hmm.
So what they just did was acknowledge the event, but then they blamed you for it.
Mm-hmm.
So when someone takes real responsibility, one of the key components of that is you don't have to ask them. They come to you and say, man, yesterday when I spoke to you so harshly, I was wrong. I apologize. Please, will you forgive me for harming you in that way? I'm really going to diligently work at not doing that and finding better ways to cope when we're in a difficult space,
Mm-hmm.
right? The motive comes from the person who did the offending. But in these unsafe relationships, what I see is the person who's offended is always going to the offender, always going to the offender. One point of strategy, I would say, don't go to the offender. Get out a piece of paper, get out a voice memo, get out of your video camera and make a video or write out the behavior that you saw that harmed you.
Yeah.
And don't go to them and say, you did this. If they never come to you and you have all this documentation, what is that telling you?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That they don't care, that they're not interested. And so then when they do come, if that ever happens, you're like, does it check out?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it an acknowledgement and a blame shift? So without somebody being able to own their own harm, whatever they've done to harm you or harm others, if they can't own that, you will never have the ability to have healthy intimacy. Healthy intimacy is the result of two people who are imperfect owning their mistakes. And as we own those mistakes, what that does is it actually builds the trust
Mm-hmm.
on an emotional level. So if you are not in a process of building trust, you're in a place where you're chasing them, you're asking, you're always disappointed, you're being blamed, you can never get any resolution, you feel crazy, you feel exhausted, you feel overwhelmed, you're tired, you don't want to go home, you're there.
Yeah.
And listen, having, created Pathway to Hope, and being in the forums there and seeing this on a daily basis and seeing the beauty of two people supporting each other. And I see it in the forums all the time, two people telling what they're going through and then having support and communication instead of judgment or fixing. Without that support, you're going to have a very hard time getting out of a difficult relationship. And if you're in the church, you're going to have a hard time because generally speaking, not every church, but generally speaking, churches are going to send you back into it and tell you to try harder, cook his favorite meal, have more sex, yada, yada, yada. Those things do not and will not ever work. They are bad, unhealthy advice.
Mm-hmm. Okay, there's something I was thinking about when you're talking about the acceptance of the behavior and the apology is, I've experienced, and I've also seen this with a lot of other women and even men that I coach who are in emotionally abusive relationships, is there's almost like a pendulum swing here with that. So I've seen it where they will accept responsibility and then, like you said, blame shifts, and that's after the person has confronted them and almost like the other person gets punished for it.
Exactly.
And, that's really intense and really hard for the other person. I've definitely grew up with a family member that used to do that to me pretty regularly, but I've also experienced the other side of it, which is they are super quick to apologize, but it's more about them than it was about me. And I don't even know how to explain it all other than it just feels gross. I'm supposed to give them a big, huge hug. It felt like it was out of guilt and shame.
Yes.
And and so over so many years of that, I mean, it worked for a little while. Like I'd be like, oh, like that person really accepted it, and like, oh, they're there. But I realized that I was being manipulated and programmed to just accept the abuse because the
Yes.
behavior
Yes.
never changed. And
Yes.
so that's the
Yes.
other side of the unsafe that I wanted to bring up, because I think that's really common.
Yes.
And it's really a mind screw, because you're
Yes.
like, oh, he seems so genuine. He's looking down and like, shaking his head, feels so bad. But why do I feel like it wasn't about me? Like, so I don't know if
And
you want
see,
to talk about
that,
that, but
what you've just brought up is so crucial because what you were doing was not paying attention to your instincts. Your instincts were going, ugh, yuck,
yeah,
ugh. But then your brain was like, well, they're apologizing. They're doing the right thing. You have to accept them. You have to forgive them. You have to
right.
work
It's
it out.
different than the other one, which was I had to confront and then they would
Yeah.
explode. And, so I was like, oh, this is better.
Yeah. Right. And so this is the other thing I say is you have to pay attention to your instincts. If your instincts are saying, go with it. But if you've been in an unsafe relationship or an abusive relationship, one of the things that that person has done is taught you not to pay attention to your instincts. Because if you paid attention to your instincts, you'd probably be out of the relationship. Right? So, but the problem with my instincts, my spirit, my gut, whatever, is it gives me information I can't prove. I just know.
Yeah,
And
it felt
in
kind of yucky. I don't know how to explain it. You're just like, oh,
yeah, yeah.
that's
And so
not
instead of
like a
having to
genuine
explain it,
apology.
yeah, instead of having to explain it, I just want you to go with it. Like I'm not
Yeah,
buying that.
right. Yeah.
And so if if you're late to the party of trust, that's way better than being early,
Hmm.
right? And so if they apologize and you don't accept it and the behavior proves out over time and then you accept it, great. But if you accept it early and that behavior returns the next day, they just cut you even deeper. So that's what you're talking about is that I made the amends, I let them back in, I trusted them, and the behavior was in the same week. They did it again.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's and
Exactly.
that's why people feel exhausted and horrible and depressed and
Yeah.
sad and defeated. It's very damaging. So I'm really glad you brought it because it's very nuanced.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
And
Yeah.
and you can't it's that's why if we made a list, because this is the problem with
Or
lists is
somebody's got a list out there.
the list puts me back in my mind. What I
Mm,
want people to do is stay in their spirit, stay in their gut, stay in their instincts. It's
okay.
screaming. I've never talked to a person who's been in a relationship that's unsafe where they didn't say, yeah, I felt it. I just didn't. I just ignored it. I just suppressed it. I just talked myself out of it. I took another shot of hopium, whatever.
Mm-hmm. So why is it people, and when I say church, I'm not meaning like every church, right?
Yeah.
But there is a stereotype for a reason, because we see a biased side of like this happens in the church a lot. But why is it's more common that people in the church feel like they can't say anything knowing that they're in an unsafe relationship?
Well, there's this whole teaching that has been going on for a long time where, you're not supposed to uncover your husband. You're not supposed to say anything negative about him. Then you have the teaching and from people, it's like you're not supposed to touch God's anointed. So, i.e., you can't ever say anything about the pastor. You have to just be respectful, which is all just religious denial.
Well, that
It's
was the other question I was going to ask.
horrible.
How does denial play into all this?
Yeah. So, religious denial is the worst because you're using God to justify your avoidance and your harm of someone else. And
Mhm.
if you're in a relationship with someone who's using the Bible and scripture and the pastor and books to get you to stay in line with what they want,
Mhm.
it's really that spiritual abuse is some of the worst because they're telling you that God is against you. And if you
Mhm.
don't comply to their harm, then you're outside of God's work or will or whatever. And
Mhm.
so that kind of stuff is infuriating. And I've heard stories that will make the hair on the back of your neck stand up from people who have used the Bible and God. And, on the outside, they're well respected, highly quote unquote successful ministers, but they are horrible people.
Mhm.
And so I've often said if you're mistreating somebody you're supposed to love, you don't have a spirit. It's dead. And so I don't care how many Bible verses you know, or how many doctorate degrees you have, or how many books you've read, or how righteous or self-righteous you are. None of that matters to me. What matters is you're mistreating somebody on a regular basis and you're justifying it with the Bible. So you're crazy. You're not healthy. And this happens all the time. It comes from the idea that men are more valuable than women. And it comes from these ideas like it's a woman's job to make her man happy. No, it's not. It's not your job. It's not your job to make a man happy. It's not your job to satisfy him sexually. What's his job? Where's the book on that? To be loving and caring. I hear this all the time, and it makes me irritated. I take that back. It angers me. I'm not going to minimize it. I hear guys say this all the time. Oh, I took my vow serious. I'm committed to this marriage. I'm going to stay. And I'm like, you took a vow to love, not to stay. You didn't take a vow to be committed. You took a vow to love, which you're clearly not doing. So this is the other thing, is we get so wrapped up in the commitment that we miss what's actually happening, which is another form of avoidance. Back to my favorite quote. The avoidance of pain is the beginning of all unhealthy behavior. And the church does it at a very high level. That's why you don't see a lot of healthy relationships on an intimate, emotional level. There's a lot of shallow relationships, because really, in the end of it, church is really based on the conformity of belief, not actual intimacy. And we're only intimate if we believe the same thing. So if you and I are in church and we have a disagreement about theology, we can't have a deep intimacy. We'll still be friends and like, hey, how you doing? But you're not really accepted, and you can't be connected because you don't have the right theology. You don't know the truth of God. And like I've said many times, there's, by some estimations, 30,000 denominations of Christianity, all saying the same thing. We have the truth of God from the Bible. I don't think so at 30,000. Mm-hmm. So that's the other thing, is that if you go to somebody to talk about your relationship problems and they don't believe you, don't go back. If they try to tell you that what you're doing, what you're seeing or perceiving isn't right, don't talk to them again. If they're your pastor, I would say don't talk to them in general. Because generally speaking, it doesn't work, because when you sit down in a pastor's office, they have an agenda, and that agenda is to keep you together. That's their theological, spiritual belief, that marriage has to stay together, because we've idolized marriage in our culture, Christian culture, and it does profound damage. And if you haven't, I interviewed Gretchen Baskerville, who wrote a great book called The Life-Saving Divorce. I would encourage somebody to pick it up. If you're a member of Pathway to Hope, you can go on there and watch my interview with her. Fantastic resource. She's done a lot of work on the scripture and unraveling all that. And having worked in divorce recovery groups for 20 years, she gets it. And she's doing a great job of educating the church on the error that we have put forth with the idea of divorce being not possible or bad.
So Patrick, I've heard you quote this a lot. If someone you love is continually harming you, the most loving thing you can do is stop them. In that case, once someone recognizes they are in an emotionally abusive relationship or harmful, what's the first thing they should do?
Well, the first thing is kind of layered. I don't think there's just one thing that you can do. I think there's multiple things. One thing I'll tell you for sure is you must, in some fashion, begin to document the behavior and the events that take place, so that in 2 days you can open that up and be reminded of what actually happened. So what that does is it starts to give you clarity. Mm-hmm. But when you don't write anything down, or you don't make any voice memos, and they're rationalizing, minimizing, justifying, gaslighting, never taking responsibility, and being, super nice or whatever, mm-hmm, you can't stay clear, and it just destroys you internally. So one thing you got to do is you got to document what's happening. Mm-hmm. A couple of things come out of that. One is you get clarity. Two is you can tell somebody else with clarity what you're experiencing. And this is what I said before. If you go to somebody and you tell them what you're experiencing and they deny it, rationalize it, push it away, tell you it's not true, they
Yeah.
try to talk you out of it, don't go back. You need to find a place. The other thing you need to do is find what I would call your assets. Where do you have support to help you manage this? Because one of the greatest needs someone has is validation of what they're experiencing. Because the person they're with is always undermining that and invalidating them and the experiences they're having and doing the blame shifting. So, that's one of the reasons why I created Pathway to Hope, was for the community of people to be safe, because it's so hard to find. Most women can't go to church and get it. You can't go to a counselor and get it because, generally speaking, a lot of counselors don't understand this stuff, and particularly if they have a Christian worldview. So document and support, okay? Validation of what you're going through. Now, I will warn you, and I want you to know this, that when you start to get clear, you're going to feel a lot of pain. The clarity moves you toward the grief, like, oh my gosh, this is worse than I thought. Oh my gosh, that's really unhealthy. Oh my gosh, that really hurts. That is healthy. But one of the things we're taught is that if you're having a struggle, if you have difficulty, it's because you're doing something wrong. You getting clear about the difficulty you're in is going to bring you pain, and that pain is what's going to lead you out. It's very important that you don't avoid that, because when you avoid it, you give the person who's harming you power. The way out is through that pain. It's not by coming up with another mousetrap that will fix it. And since you can't control another person, you putting effort into fixing them is a waste of energy. What I want you to do is just take 1/10 of the energy that you spend on them and spend it on you. If you just did that, your life would begin to radically change.
Thank you so much for that. If you want to learn more about Pathway to Hope, check out the link in the description, and stay tuned for the next episode with Patrick Doyle.
And thanks everybody for tuning in and sending the questions. And, again, if this material is helpful, please do subscribe and hit the like button and help us with our YouTube algorithm.
Yeah, it'd be great. Share it with others too.
Yes,
Guys.
please do. Yeah, thank you.